Hello, landlords. This is Ernie Garcia. This is an exciting new thing that I'm trying out today. This is my first YouTube Live, and I want to come to you with a talk that I've shared numerous times with other landlords, but for the first time, live on Facebook. So I'm excited. I'm sorry, live on YouTube. I'm excited to be here and to talk to you about the 4 things that I always recommend to landlords that they should be ready to present whenever they are in an eviction court. Because the truth is, it can be intimidating enough just staying in front of a judge. Before that, it's intimidating filling out the forms and knowing exactly what to put in your eviction petition. And before that, it's terrifying to talk sometimes, if you've never done this before, with your tenants about the prospect of an eviction. These kinds of things can be absolutely petrifying if you've never ever done these before. So I want to give you some really useful advice on what you can do whenever you are in front of that eviction judge presenting your case for an eviction trial. Now, before I get too far into this, for those of you who are interested, particularly those of you who live in Texas, for any of you who have followed me for an extended period of time, you know that I practice in Houston, Texas, but that I serve clients all over the state. However, sometimes there are clients who say, Ernie, I want to learn a little bit on my own how to do this process. I watch your videos, but I'm still not confident in how to send a proper notice or how to file the eviction or what to say once I'm standing in front of the judge. So I've come up with a do-it-yourself course. There's a link in the description of this video that you can check out if you're interested in taking a look at the kinds of things that we do in the state of Texas. Particularly if you're a landlord with rental property in Texas. Check that out. I believe it'll be extremely helpful. It's called Texas Eviction from Start to Finish, step-by-step course for you that I've created that includes forms. It includes an ebook where I walk you through that process. It's a video course, so you're going to hear my voice and see me explaining each and every step. I break down the eviction process in a 6-module, step-by-step process, again, with forms that I show you how to fill out for a Texas eviction. If this is something that interests you, check it out in the description below. But now you find yourself in front of an eviction judge. What are the 4 things that are the most important that you want to prove in order to win your eviction case? Well, it starts off very simply with your agreement. What is it that you, the landlord, and the tenant have agreed to? Now, in the state of Texas and in many other states, it's possible to have a purely oral agreement. And that agreement essentially is rent in exchange for an address. Now, while I don't recommend this, it's perfectly legal to have it. If that's your case, then your agreement is my tenant agreed to pay this amount of rent for this particular property. And that's all you'll be proving up with regard to an oral lease agreement. However, for the vast majority of you out there, you're going to have a written lease. And your written lease is going to have not just rent obligations, but even numerous non-rent obligations. For example, your tenant might be subject to the restrictions of a homeowners association. You may have strict limitations with regard to pets. Maybe you have very limited occupancy requirements, and so any unauthorized occupants would be a violation of your lease. So the agreement is either an oral agreement that really just talks about rent and the address of the property, or a written agreement that extensively explains what the landlord is leasing to the tenant in exchange for a certain amount of rent and the expectations of both parties. What is your agreement? That's typically your lease in a 1-word answer. Make sure that you're able to present that to the court at the time of your eviction trial. The second thing that you're going to prove to the court is what was the breach. Again, if we're going back to that oral agreement, the only thing that can be breached is non-payment of rent. Because that's really the only thing that you would need to prove. We had an agreement for rent, it was not paid. And so you explain to the court that the tenant failed to pay rent. Now, dates are probably going to be key, more so when you have a written agreement, because rent is just one of the bases that you could have for an eviction with a written agreement. You might have, as I've described, some non-rent based violations that essentially add up to a significant enough reason to terminate the lease. The breach is usually a matter that's explained in your written lease in the default provision. Look in your lease to see if there's a specific section that describes what default is. Now, this is usually going to start off with non-payment rent. That's the easy one. Non-payment, 100% of the time, that's a default that you're going to be able to use against your tenant for eviction. But sometimes these non-rent problems can be cured. And so if you've issued a notice to vacate and your tenant has cured it, that's a good thing. They're no longer doing, or they've started doing something they're required to do because you've issued a notice of default, and now the problem is fixed. But when it might lead to an eviction is when you've had to cite numerous things for the tenant to do, and the tenant still hasn't cured those defaults. This would likely rise to a level, no matter where you are in the US, to where you can say, my lease and state law allow me to evict you at this point. And so because you have failed to do X and Y and Z, I'm issuing you not a notice of default, which I've done numerous times already. I'm issuing a notice to vacate. And so because there's been a breach of some part of the lease that you can point to and illustrate to the court quite clearly, section X was violated or section Y was violated, and here is the term, and here's my proof of that violation. Typically for non-payment of rent, you're going to show a ledger that's got some missing cash. But with these other, you might, for example, have an unauthorized pet, and you've got a picture of it, or you've got a letter from a homeowners association because that tenant just isn't cutting the grass in compliance with the terms of the lease. So these things serve as evidence of the breach. So first thing you're proving is your agreement. Second thing is the breach. The third thing you're going to prove is your notice. So we talked about it in the previous one. You get to a point where you absolutely have to issue a notice to vacate. Typically, I recommend that a landlord not go more than 7 days without receiving the full amount of rent before you issue a notice to vacate. Some landlords are queasy about this, and they're like, well, I don't feel good about it until it's a whole month late. Maybe, but understand that if you're giving your tenant an entire month to pay that month's rent, the following month is in jeopardy, absolutely. And so the likelihood that they're going to pay 2 months of rent when they had difficulty paying one, not very high. So in my calculus, once you get to day 7, that's really probably the last time that they'll be able to catch up in this month and still be okay for the next month. If they have not done that by day 7, they haven't paid the full amount of rent, then you probably should issue a notice to vacate. Now, your state may have different rules on how many days that notice is required to have. I'm not going to get into all of that because it varies from state to state. But make sure that when you issue your notice to vacate, that you issue it in compliance, number 1, with your lease, and number 2, with your state's rules and regulations. If you're not doing this, you're likely going to get turned around by the court because you did not, in fact, deliver a proper notice to vacate. So if you're delivering it, make sure that that notice is proper in terms of its substance, what it says. Does that line up and give the tenant a fair warning that they are in default and subject to an eviction? Does it actually point to what that default is? Does it have all of the requirements that your state or local government require out of you as a landlord? If it doesn't, and you don't know what those requirements are, then I would take a step back and make sure you are in compliance before you ever issue that notice to vacate. You don't want to send a defective notice because ultimately that's going to lead to a defective eviction filing. So step 1, you have an agreement. Step 2, you have a breach. And step 3, in front of that court, you've got a notice to vacate. Once you've established these three things, you're practically there. At the finish line is the last thing you're likely going to have to prove to the court, which are your damages. Now, in the state of Texas, we're not allowed to ask for anything more than unpaid rent. Most states have similar limitations in an eviction process. Your state may allow other things, but in the state of Texas, we're limited to unpaid rent. You should be able to articulate to the court precisely what's owed within the rules of that jurisdiction. How much is owed? Don't show up with estimates to the court. Make sure that your lease is explicit in what amounts are owed and that your ledger records what amounts have been paid so that you can illustrate to the court very easily what is owed to you out of a judgment if a judgment is signed that day of trial. Now, one thing that often trips up landlords when they're proving up their damages is they have this non-linear way of arriving at how much money they're owed because they don't properly apply payments as they come in. In my state, in the state of Texas, it's very, very simple. And I don't know this to be different across the US, but if you're taking a payment and applying it to the current month when prior months remain unpaid, you're probably doing it wrong. What you should be doing every single time you take a payment is you apply it to the oldest debt first. I equate this to filling a cup, right? So you have a cup and then you've got water. You never fill a cup and leave gaps just because time passed. Always, always you fill and it rises from the deepest part of the cup up to the top. And once it's filled, we know that everything has been paid in accordance with your agreement. But if there's a matter that's unfilled, then we know there is a deficiency, and that's the current balance that's owed. So anytime you get a payment, make sure it goes to oldest debt first so that anything that remains unfilled is that balance that you're presenting to the court. Your ledger should say something similar to it. And so, again, you want to prove these basic four things if ever you are in front of an eviction court. What is the agreement? What was the breach? Did you deliver that notice? And what are your damages? These four things are the bedrock of an eviction filing. And I'm sure that that's generally true across the U.S., but nowhere is it more true than here in the great state of Texas. And for those of you who are filing or have never filed before, or maybe only did it a couple of times and maybe screwed up the process, and you want something you can rely on as a way to understand the eviction process, I strongly recommend that you check out the description and you see that course, Texas Eviction from start to finish, everything you need to know in a step-by-step process that you can see with forms, explanation in text. There's an ebook that comes with it along with my video and the 6 modules that I go through. If that's something you're interested in, I very much welcome you to check that out. You can also check out everything we've got here on YouTube, which is a deep library of over 600 videos of things that you can watch right now for absolutely free that talk about landlording and the landlording procedures that I have seen in Texas courts throughout my career. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been making videos for a while too, explaining what it is that you can expect out of an eviction court, but also things that are outside of the courts and how to manage tenants and how to essentially interpret and enforce terms in a lease to your maximum benefit. Landlords, I appreciate you attending. For those of you who watch live, any of your comments that you leave those below. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. I very much appreciate that. But until next time, landlords, thank you so much and happy leasing.